How we spend our time is how we spend our lives. If we are frittering our time away in indecision or applying it in a lot of little ways, but not really to things that matter, how we spend our time is how we spend our lives. And too often we wear busyness like this badge of honor. If you walk through your hospital or your ER and you ask somebody, I'll pick on some random names here, like, oh, Morgan, how are you? Morgan says, busy. Claire, how are you? Crazy busy. Nicholas, how are you? Super busy. We are all always so busy. And yet we find even though our plates are full, we don't have enough time for the things that really matter for us most. So my name is Christina Shenvi, and I'm a practicing emergency physician, and I've been teaching and coaching medical students, physicians, and other high-performing professionals for several years on how to do more with less stress. And I'm going to put a link in the chat. You can click on it directly, perfect. This is to a Dropbox that will have handouts of the slides and a worksheet that I encourage you to go back to later and fill in. I also, and this is provocative here, I encourage you to power down your other devices or close down your other screen with the email, because we know that trying to do more than one thing that requires actually all of your attention is not only draining, but we're really not that good at it. Even just having a phone on the table next to you can make it harder to do complex tasks. So my gift to you today is 1 hour to do nothing else than what you are thinking about right now. I encourage you to take some old school notes, and I'll put the link to the Dropbox folder in there again for those who just joined. There's a worksheet on there. You can use that to take notes, or you can use it later to do some deep reflection. Now, hopefully some of you are on the chat and not driving. If you are not driving, I want you to consider and put in the chat, what are the biggest challenges that you currently face with your time management? What are the biggest challenges? And I'll wait a minute for people to put them in the chat. You are all busy physicians. Good. Dan says lack of priority list for tasks. So we have all these tasks, but how do you prioritize? Finding time for long-term projects. Yes, Christine, absolutely. Moshe says carving out time for research and publications. Yes, we'll talk about that. Andrew, distraction. There you go. Phone away. Start the distraction, the weaning from distraction. Feeling like no time for self-care. Yes, Eileen. Paige, burnout. Hey, Paige. Knowing what we need to do to take care of ourselves and to help burnout, but not being able to create the time for doing it. Claire says time for unexpected things. Yes, time derailers, when you didn't expect that your kids would have a snow day at home, and now you do. Nicholas, fitting everything in, giving myself time beyond the 1 hour for my sanity. Being able to choose my priority list. Excellent. Balancing personal and family commitments with clinical responsibilities. Thank you for sharing those. Now, often when you go to talks on time management, and some of them are great, I love them, but it kind of boils down to what I call a cram it all in method, which is if I just had the right app, if I just had the right calendar scheduling, if I could just coordinate all the stuff with my spouse or partner, then we would be able to cram it all in. But when we do that, what goes first? Well, sleep goes first, self-care goes next, time with family goes after that, exercising somewhere in there as well, maybe eating well. So when we try to cram it all in, the first things that go are the things that matter most to us in the long term, ironically. So to get different results, we have to have different actions. To get different actions, though, we need to feel and think differently. So the take home here is that it's really not, spoiler, it's not about managing your time. Time is not Play-Doh that you can mold into something. It's really about managing yourself and managing how you think differently. David Allen has written a number of books on productivity, and he says to be effective, you have to have a mind like water. You need to be calm, fluid, flexible, deep. Instead, oftentimes our minds feel more like this kind of water. We try to sit and focus, and then there's all this mind trash that comes up. There's mind trash that says, you're not good enough to be doing this. There's mind trash that says, why bother writing this paper if it's just going to get rejected? There's all the other things that bubble up to the surface, like, oh, I've got to get this done. I've got to do my emails. I've got to pay my rent. I have to pick up my kids. all of those things. So the goals of time empowerment is not to just cram it all in, but it's to do more of what really matters and to feel less stress and overwhelm. So and I'll put it one more time in the chat, in the link here in the chat, there is a workbook for you to think about later. And I want you to reflect on what would an absolutely perfect schedule look like for you and what is keeping you from it. Now, the first thing that pops into my mind when I think about that is beaches, martinis or margaritas, and nothing to do all day but read some great sci-fi and fantasy books and maybe some medical papers. But most of the time we think, oh, we just want a vacation. But honestly, after a little time of vacation, then we would probably want to do some work. So within the constraints of, I also need to keep an income, what would an absolutely perfect schedule look like for you? This is my model. This is my 4-step model for empowering your time. And almost any problem or difficulty with your time management can be described in terms of a failure or difficulty with one of these steps. So first deciding, then planning, then how you do things when you sit down to actually do them, and then reflecting and being honest. So that is why I'm such a firm believer in the workbook that you can reflect with later. So let's start. We're going to work through each of these 4. First, deciding. And I'll break this into agency and vision. The only way to get more time in your day is to be strategic with what you do and efficient in how you do it. And the way that you start with that is you claim full agency over your time. Many times we look at our day and we're like, oh, I have to do this. I have to do that. I have to go to a shift. You don't have to go to any shifts. You don't have to go to work ever again. You can decide not to do anything. Now, I don't recommend that. If there's residents on the call, I don't recommend telling your program director, you don't have to go to work tomorrow, but you have a choice. You are here for a reason. You chose to do medicine. You chose this job. You chose this residency program. Own it. This is my friend, Janelle Brown, who's a successful GYN surgeon. And while she was a fellow, somebody asked her, how do you have time to always have your hair and makeup done? You're getting into the hospital at 5 a.m. How do you have time? And she said, I don't have time. I make time. Now, that is a silly example, and it may seem like a minor shift, but just begin to notice how you speak about time. Like time is this thing that we're always chasing. Time is not on our side. Time is against us. We are always a victim to all the things that we have to do. And we know from the studies and research that that sense of learned helplessness reduces our creativity and our problem-solving capabilities. So when we are ensconced in that mindset of, I can't control my life, everything is just happening to me, we actually lose the creativity that we need to create something different. I am a big fan of Stoic philosophy, and this was a form of philosophy that grew up about 2,000 plus years ago. And the central tenet, or one of the central tenets, is that they were pursuing, in Greek, eudaimonia, which means perfect human flourishing. And Marcus Aurelius was a famous Stoic philosopher, and he said, it is essential for you to remember that the attention you give to any action should be in due proportion to its worth. So I have summarized that for you, since I have more of a quantitative mind. The attention that you give something should be in direct proportion to its worth. Now, thinking about what you do, where are you spending a whole lot of attention on things that don't really matter to you? And where are you not paying attention to things that do matter to you? The other thing is that once we kind of own our time, own our agency, let's look at what really does matter to us. To do this, I want to introduce the idea of the BHAG. This comes from a book by Jim Collins. In his book, Built to Last, he coined the acronym BHAG, or Big, Hairy, Audacious Goal. And what he did was essentially a business twin study. He looked at companies that were similar in similar industries, similar times, similar resources, and looked at which companies were successful over the long term. And he found that one of the requirements is the companies that were successful had some sort of unifying vision or mission, and that drove the relentless sense of urgency to get things done. Here's a couple cool examples. One is Donald Berwick. He was the CEO of the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, and he launched what was called the 100,000 Lives campaign. And it was very specific. He wanted to save 100,000 lives from iatrogenic or hospital-borne injuries and infections. He said, some is not a number, soon is not a time, 100,000 by June 14th at 9 a.m. So creating that very clear vision of what he wanted to accomplish allowed that relentless sense of urgency for all the little ways that it took to get that done. Or consider JFK. He had the vision of, before this decade is out, landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. There's a probably apocryphal story of when JFK visited the Space Center in Florida, and he walked around meeting people, and he met one man who was a janitor. And he asked the man, "What do you do here?" And the janitor said, "I'm putting a man on the moon." So taking part in that shared vision transformed the work that the janitor did from cleaning trash cans and mopping floors to, I am part of putting a man on the moon. Another way to think about this is, what are your hedgehogs? The hedgehog concept comes from this, also a Jim Collins book, but comes from a fragment of an ancient poem that says, the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. And one of the most common problems that I see among high-performing professionals who come to me for help is that they are trying to carry 25 hedgehogs. They've got so many things that they're trying to do, all of which they feel like are important to them. And they may be. Now, you can have a few hedgehogs. My family is a hedgehog. My, ER work is a hedgehog. My educational work is a hedgehog. But you can't have 25 hedgehogs, or else you end up not taking good care of any of them. So what are your hedgehogs? Once you understand that, once you have identified the things that are truly important to you, that allows you to ask the question, what can only I do, and what can I outsource or delegate? For example, these are my kids. I am the only person on the planet who can have mommy time with my kids. I can pay a babysitter, I can pay somebody to deliver food, I can pay somebody to clean the house if I need to, but nobody else on the earth can have mommy time with my kids. Similarly, I cannot pay someone to go on a date with my husband. It's just very awkward. Only I can do that. But that allows you to then say, okay, these are the things that only I can do. How can I relentlessly delegate or outsource things that are not aligned with my mission and vision and that don't really matter as much to me in this season of life? Your hedgehogs will kind of come and go and change with seasons. And once your kids are out of the house, maybe that hedgehog becomes not something that you have to take care of on a daily basis. Once you understand your big values and mission, it also allows you to answer the question, what things do I need to do A+ work on, and what things can I do B- work on? So for example, for me, education, giving a talk, I really want that to be an A+ work. Taking care of my house, having, matching furniture and curtains, that's a solid B- for me. It really just doesn't matter to me. Many times, for example, charting, some people get so caught up in this has to be A+ work, when actually nobody would really notice, and it would save you hours a day if you said, all right, this can just be B- work. It has to be sufficient. It doesn't have to be exemplary. So think about, does how you spend your time and energy reflect your big values? And if not, why not? Is it because you're giving up ownership and agency? You're being too much dictated by other people or other people's expectations? So some practical steps here are to first write down what's important to you, and then write down all the things that you do and match up. Are they even in those categories? And then you can look at the yearly, weekly, or daily timeframes and say, okay, this year, what is important for me to accomplish? This week, today, what is the #1 priority that I must do today? One of the practical ways I do this is I keep a list of, this is everything I want to do today. And then I prioritize it. So I say, okay, I can't do 25 things, but I can do 3 things. And I must do these 3 things. Come hell or high water, these 3 things will get done. And that allows me to make sure that I'm working on the things that are most important to me. Now, you've decided, you own your time, you have created your vision. Now, how do we create a plan and prioritize even more? Well, one way to frame this is through the Japanese concept called Ikigai, which is kind of your reason for being. And it occurs at the intersection of what you're good at, what you love, what the world needs, and ideally what you can be paid for, although that's probably the first one to go. And what I encourage you to do on the worksheet is write down, again, take that list of all the things you're doing, whether it's work-related, committees, things you're paid for, Little League or whatever, all those things that you're doing, and then draw an arrow to where they land on this Venn diagram. Do you love it and you're good at it, but nobody really needs it? Or does the world need it, but you actually hate doing it and you're just paid for it? You're paid to do it. Plenty of things fall in that category. But you will notice that the things that have the most overlap are where your heart really is. So focusing on those things. Here's another way to frame it. Now, some of you said in the chat at the beginning about what was most difficult is doing those things like writing papers that are important to you, but they're not urgent, right? I have a paper I'm writing. If I submit it this month, if I submit it 6 months from now, it's not going to be that big a difference. So it's never really urgent, but it's important to me. And the trouble is we are constantly day to day living, with our noses just above the water saying, I just have to get this done today, that we don't have time to create. We don't create the time for those things that are not urgent, but are important, that actually give us more fulfillment. Maybe it's writing a book, launching an entrepreneurial company, doing another degree program, or whatever it is. Or we have things that we know we're going to have to do at some point, but they're not urgent yet. And we wait until they're due the night before. And now all of a sudden it moves into the urgent category and we kick in gear and we do it. Or we decide, you know what, it's just never going to happen. I'm just going to forget about it. So by being intentional with how we structure our time, we can create enough bandwidth that we're not constantly putting out fires. And then we can plan and schedule in the things that are important to us, but not urgent. One of the other things that's in that Dropbox folder that I sent you is an Excel spreadsheet. Now, I am a very analytical person. My love language is Excel spreadsheets, but I encourage you to track your time for a week. This is a friend of mine's book, Laura Vanderkam. She's written a number of books on productivity and time management. And her central premise is that, again, this is provocative, you have more time than you think. And you don't know that that's the case until you look at your time. And I know many of us bristle. You're like, Laura, how dare you tell me I have more time than I think? You haven't seen my schedule. You haven't seen my life. But hear us out a little bit. If you track your time, then you will start to see where you are spending too much time on things that don't matter, or where you're doing things in a way that's not efficient. And I'll talk more about that. But also, you may have been told at some point, you can do it all. This sounds so empowering. We love to say this to people. Of course, that sounds like a great job, great idea to take this 80-hour-a-week job while you also have young children. I don't want to tell you you can't do it all. But let me just go ahead and disabuse you of that notion. There are only 168 hours in the week, and you cannot get more than that. You can always make more money. You cannot make more time. So you can really not do it all. What that means then is that you have to be selective with what you do and intentional. Now, when people track their time, often if we, kind of looked at their time, they've got some time at work, some time at sleep, some prep time. People tend to overestimate how much time they're working. They think, oh my gosh, it must be 70 hours a week. And then it's actually 40 hours or 45 hours. And they underestimate the free time that they have. And then when you actually look at what they're doing with their free time, they may say, oh yeah, I watch 2 hours of television a week. And then when you track it, you realize it's more like 20 hours a week. Or on those little, 10 minutes of time here and there on Facebook, that adds up to another, 15 hours a week. So I encourage you as a first step to kind of take control of your time is to track your time for a week. And this is what the output on the Excel spreadsheet that I put in the folder will be. It will show you in different categories that you create. Look at it from the lenses of priority. Are you doing the things that matter most to you? Strategy, are you doing them in the right way? Or are you kind of disorganized so you're not really structuring and you're spending too much time on things? And then efficiency, are you doing them in the right amount of time? So there we go. Once you have figured out, okay, where's your time going and where can you use it more strategically, the next thing to think about is planning your work in terms of deep and shallow work. So let me introduce this idea a little bit more. Cal Newport in his book, Deep Work, talks all about focus and how we have lost focus and the importance of working with a deep focus. And he gives this deep work equation. that the high quality work that you produce equals the time spent times your intensity of focus. So you could spend 4 hours working on something when you're not really thinking about it. You're also checking email, you're also on Instagram, you're also on Twitter, and you're getting constantly interrupted. Or you could spend 1 hour, really focus, and get that whole thing done. So think about this. If I'm even, and some of this does not really apply as well to your clinical work, but when you're thinking about your other academic work, what is the work that you have to do that is deep work? So the focus, distraction-free, deep thinking and planning, really thinking about the thing, not just thinking of the fact that you have to do it. And this work tends to bring more joy and fulfillment. It's all those important but less urgent things. Whereas the shallow work is the short, interrupted, not really much creativity, like a lot of emails and admin and things like that. And working with a deep focus is important to protect your cognitive bandwidth. Now, you guys know from emergency medicine, the problems with trying to multitask. Now, you can multitask with simple things. You can walk and chew gum, you can drive and listen to music, but our brains don't like frenetically and rapidly task switching. It is exhausting and it depletes our cognitive bandwidth. Cal Newport says, if you spend enough time in frenetic shallowness, you permanently reduce your capacity to perform deep work. So how can we do deep work? First, create the mental space. And I'll talk about this at the end. Looking at your thoughts to say, why are my thoughts scattered and disorganized? Because if I am acting in a scattered, disorganized way, that is because my thoughts are scattered and disorganized. If I am undermining myself by telling myself a constant narrative of, you're not going to be good enough, this is going to be terrible, then you're going to procrastinate more. So first, clear the mental space. Second, create time blocks. It is very hard to do deep work for 5 minutes at a time. You really need to schedule chunks of time in your calendar where you say, here is where I'm going to work on that. And then plan ahead of time what you will do with that time. If you sit down for your deep work time and you haven't said, okay, I'm going to work on the methods section of that paper, then all of a sudden your brain will say, let me just check my email. Let me just answer these text messages. Let me just do this easy, shallow work instead of really applying myself to the difficult task. And third, assess how much deep and shallow work are you doing and how could you cluster it or clump it better to work more efficiently. So create the mental space, create the time blocks, and then when that time block comes, work with a deep focus. How do you do that? First, avoid interruptions. So intentionally structuring your environment and your calendar so that you can avoid interruptions. And then avoid rapid task switching or trying to multitask. And third, create cognitive closure. When something is done, check it off, mark it so you can cognitively put it to bed. So let's unpack some of those. Look at these two models where the light blue is the work that you're trying to do and the purple is the emails, the other interruptions, etc. Not working in the ER, so your non-clinical time, what does your day look most like? And I would wager for most of us, it looks like this top bar. We're constantly switching from one thing to another. When you do that, studies have shown you end up spending more time overall in those shallow tasks, in the emails, as opposed to if you chunk them, you say, I'm going to do 45 minutes of email and I'm just going to line it up and knock it out. And then I'm going to fully clear my, my digital space and I'm going to work only on that one task. You spend less time doing emails if you do it that way. The other problem with rapid task switching is that we have an attention residue. And this is just a graphic illustration. It's not a real study, but let's say you're working on task 1 and then you switch to task 2. Part of your attention is residually on task 1. And then you switch to task 3. So now you're still kind of thinking of task 2 and task 1. Or there's a lot going on in the background, and that makes it hard to focus. So rapidly switching tasks before a task is done and you have cognitive closure makes it harder to focus on the next task. The third reason that interruptions cause problems is that there's a lag each time from when you stop one task to when you resume it. Each time there is a lag of, even if it's 60 to 90 seconds, where you have to go back in, remind yourself what you were thinking about, what sentence you were writing. But if you have, studies show, up to 60 or 70 interruptions per day, then that 70 to 90 seconds adds up. That's over an hour. So think about, if we go back to this, this time block here, if you have, let's say, an 8-hour day to do things, or maybe 4 hours, you have 4 hours to do things. If each of those hours worth of work you do in 45 minutes instead of in an hour, you have now made 1 hour of additional time. Or for an 8-hour day, if every hour's worth of work, I say, I'm going to focus and sprint, and I'm going to get this done in 45 minutes instead of an hour. By the end of the day, I have made up 2 hours of time. And there's the time where I can go to the gym, or I can go home earlier, or I can do those important but not urgent tasks. So working efficiently by reducing interruptions and distractions is key. I think about this like a Japanese bullet train. It can get up to super high speeds, but if it stops every 2 miles, it never really gets up to speed. And the same is true of our brains. It takes like a little while, they're chugging along to get up to speed. And if we're constantly switching, that's like stopping at a station every 2 miles. This is especially important for people who have ADHD, where the distractions are even harder to come back from. So maintaining that focus and creating longer chunks of time is even more important. So that's working with a deep focus. The other side of that, though, is that we have to have an efficient system to manage the shallow work. So schedule the shallow work into your day. Let's say you have that chunk of time for email. Then you want an approach to your email. First, delete as much as is humanly possible. Don't delete things that people really wanted you to read, because that's just annoying and unprofessional, but delete as much as you humanly can. If it will take less than 2 minutes, then do it. If it is something that you can outsource or delegate, especially, as you get further up and you have people who can help you, delegate it. And then if it's something that will take more than 2 minutes, that is now deep work. So if somebody says, can you write me a letter, or can you review this manuscript? I can't do that in 2 minutes. That is going to become deep work that I will now add to a task or list or something else. And then defer it. If it's not in line with your values that you've already identified, decline it. Then you can say no. No is a complete sentence. And then desubscribe to clear out your email of clutter to reduce all that cognitive load. So how can we work efficiently? Well, first, having that mind like water, and I'll talk more about that. But then second, close the loops. David Allen talks about this. He says, open loops are the enemy of productivity. And I think about it like this, like the game of Pong. So this was an old school game where there was this little bar at the bottom, and you had to move it side to side to keep this ball from bouncing off the bottom of the screen. So let's say you're sitting there trying to do your deep work, and then a thought pops into your head. And the thought is like, oh my gosh, I've got to pick up milk. There's snow coming down in the South. We go buy milk and bread. We get our milk and bread soups that we make. So I've got to go buy milk. And now that thought is like a live pong ball bouncing around. And then you think, oh, while I'm there, I also should pick up a present for my kid. It's their birthday coming up. And then you think, oh, shoot, I also have forgotten I have to do my tax paperwork. Also, I forgot I didn't log my hours. I need to go back and do that. And all these things pop into our heads. And now all of our focus is taken up by trying to keep these pong balls in the air. And then we can't fully focus on what we're trying to do. So creating a system is about removing these live pong balls and stacking them somewhere reliable. And the research shows that if you even just write something down, say when those things come in your head, you write down, milk, present, whatever, it takes it out of your head and it stops that cognitive activation that's happening. It stops those intrusive thoughts, and it allows you to have better performance on the task that you're doing. So how can you stack those pong balls? There are tons of systems out there. It doesn't as much matter what you use, as long as what you use consistently. So you don't want, people will start, I'll start Todoist. Then they have a few things there, then they abandon it. Then they start Wunderlist, then they start Google Tasks, and nothing really sticks. The simplest method is just to have some paper somewhere or a list where you write down all these things. This works, but only if you come back to it, and it's not ideal because it isn't categorized. You don't have the right list at the right time when you need it. A slightly more complicated method is to categorize it on paper. And this is actually what I do. I have tried all the programs out there, but I just love my old school paper and pen. So when a thought comes into my head of, oh, I've really got to do that tax thing, that would go under personal, and I would put that in as a thing to do. And then I'll add all my writing, all my talks, all my admin, and a date when it's due. And then I look at that daily and I say, okay, what do I need to do today? And what is the next task on that project? So for example, write paper X, that is not a task, that is a project. So then what I would do in that day would be a task, which is a subset. Like today might be write method section. There are tons of ways out there. If you like paper, then bullet journals or planners. If you like online, there are lots of apps out there. My favorite is Trello, and I'll show you an example of that. But I do it with a little bit of caution, because the trouble with online apps is it's very easy to just add and add and add and add and add and add more and more and more until it's so overwhelming and ballooned that we realize this to-do list is going to outlive me. There's a saying in different crafting groups that is people who, you like to craft, you like to crochet or knit, and you see a nice thing of yarn and you go buy it. And then at some point you realize your yarn stash exceeds your own life expectancy. And we can so easily do that with to-do lists, where we have so many things to do that we realize, oh my gosh, I can never do all of these. So be careful. But that said, this is an example of Trello and how this is set up. So I have different workspaces of my personal things, other projects, career ideas, books I want to read, and talks or travel that are coming up. And then if I click on one of these, I have my upcoming talks that I need to do. And then once I've done them, I can delete them, or I can put the little green bar that shows that it's done, different registration, different people I need to call about things. So it keeps it organized into categories. This is what I call my BILF list, my books I'd like to finish list of different categories and who recommended them. It doesn't really matter what system you use. You just have to create a system and stick to it. Similarly with your emails, create a system to manage them. And I have a whole talk I can do about just email. And create a system for your files so you're not wasting tons of time looking for things. So to work with a deep focus, avoid interruptions, avoid rapid task switching, and create cognitive closure. That means once you finish something, you check it off, you take a deep breath, and you move on. Otherwise, your brain continues to think about it. And this is about what we are doing in the small ways each and every day. Our success is not going to be one big, whack that we whack it out of the park. Life is not a par one course. Life is a par, thousands and thousands. Every day we move it forward a foot or 2 feet. We're not doing these giant acts that then lead to success. What we are, Aristotle said, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. So we've decided what's important to us. We're planning out our time based on our deep work and our shallow work. Now let's see, what do we do with this problem? So we've scheduled, okay, I've got 2 hours. I'm going to write that method section for my paper. And we sit down and our brain says, I don't really want to do this. I hate writing. And this is the part where managing our time is really about managing ourselves. This is from a New York Times article on procrastination. And the author says, people engage in this irrational cycle of chronic procrastination because of an inability to manage negative moods around a task. Or procrastination is self-harm. At its core, it's about emotions, not productivity. So I want to show you just a cool model and some cool data about this. About how managing our time is really about managing ourselves and our thoughts about ourselves. And this is called self-worth theory. And it plays out all the time with students that I work with. The idea is you have some abilities, then you put in effort that leads to your performance, and then that's how we get our sense of worth. And self-worth is this critical dimension of human functioning. We always want to protect our self-worth. So what happens if we are worried we're going to fail? This paper won't get accepted. My PI or my boss will think it's terrible, or I'm going to take this exam and fail for students. What do? Well, we sever the link between our abilities and our performance. And we do that with what are called self-worth protection strategies. These are maladaptive patterns of behavior that we use to protect our self-worth in case we fail. So let me make this concrete. This was a study from the 70s done on students. And they looked at the levels of shame or incompetency that people felt after they failed a test. Students who had put in lots and lots of effort, E+ for effort, and who had failed felt really high levels of shame. Students who had put in a lot of effort but had excuses at the ready felt less shame. So this is where they say, oh, my car broke down. Oh, I got strep throat. Oh, my girlfriend broke up with me. Those things may be true, but using them as an excuse reduces the amount of shame that we feel at failure. Students who put in low effort felt less shame. Now they may feel some guilt, like, oh, I feel guilty, but they can tell themselves, oh, I didn't study till the last minute. Oh, I barely worked at all. And then if they succeed, it's a double-edged sword because then they think, oh, I'm smarter than I thought. And if they fail, it protects them from that shame. Finally, students who put in low effort and had excuses felt the least shame. So how does this play out for you? Maybe it's withholding effort. Maybe it's procrastination. Maybe it's not truly pouring your heart and soul into something because you're worried that if it fails, you'll feel bad. Maybe it's disorganization. Telling yourself, oh, I'm just a disorganized person. I'm just a last minute kind of guy. Or, people who say, oh, I work best at the last minute. No, it's just that they only work at the last minute. And the research and studies on procrastination show that actually you do better if you do it not at the last minute. But some people have gotten so addicted to needing that last minute push that that's the only times they really get work done. So notice how that might play out for you, withholding effort, having ready excuses, or lowering your expectations. Oh, I just know this is going to be terrible. It's just going to be awful. I know this is going to be rejected. We're doing that sometimes to protect our self-worth. Now, the other problem that we run into when we have kind of absorbed and bought into this model is other times we put in way too much effort. We overwork, we become perfectionists because we do not want at all costs something to fail because that would affect our self-worth. So how can we have some practical strategies to avoid self-sabotage? Well, first, focus on effort rather than abilities. I showed you this, but really our efforts matter less. Our abilities matter less and our effort matters more. And that's important because our abilities, we're somewhat limited. For example, I will never be a basketball star at 5'4". That's just limited. But for other things, my effort are what matters more. If you've read the book Grit, and I also in the folder put a list of books and recommended reading, Angela Duckworth creates the framework that effort counts twice. So we have our talent. If I'm 5'4", that may be part of my talent. And I put in effort and that gives me skill. And then I take my skill and put in effort and that gives me achievement. I think about it this way, that your talent is your position and your effort is your velocity. So focusing on effort rather than abilities. Second, as educators, I have to throw in a little, educational theory here, but learn to love the process itself. And this comes from what's called achievement goal theory. And the idea is when we pursue learning, when we love learning, we have a desire for knowledge. We see difficulty as a challenge. We see intelligence as malleable. That leads us to have high levels of effort and then adaptive behaviors and cognitions and more deep level processing, more persistence, more pride, less anxiety, as opposed to if we are pursuing just performance, where there's a constant desire to prove ourselves, to look smart, to avoid looking incompetent, comparing ourselves to others. Failure is a constant threat. Ironically, often that leads us to not put in effort in the right ways. It leads to maladaptive behaviors, and it leads to more task avoidance, to negative self-talk, and use of those self-worth protection strategies of procrastination. If you've read the book Mindset, this may resonate with you with a growth mindset. And the idea is if you approach things in that way, then when you fail, rather than reflecting it back onto your self-worth, you are curious and you ask the question, how do I need to change my effort to get a different result next time? Third, fully decouple performance and self-worth. Now, this is not something that I can just, snap my fingers and we'll all agree to do this because we have ingrained this idea so much. But what if we took self-worth completely out of the equation? I was working with a group of students, and one student I'll call Sarah. She said she had been really procrastinating working on her paper because she was worried that her PI wouldn't like it. And so she had just kept putting it off because she was so worried about that. And so we said, well, where does Sarah's worth come from? And some of the students said, well, from all her past success, she got into med school, she's done well in med school. And I said, well, what if she hadn't gotten into med school? Would she have any less worth? And they kind of, reluctantly shook their heads. I said, okay, so where does her worth come from? And someone else said, well, from her family and friends who love her. And I said, well, what about if her family and friends don't love her anymore? Does she have any less self-worth? And finally, they sort of came to the conclusion that yes, there is nothing that can make you drop down below 100% and totally full of self-worth. And ironically, despite all of our striving, there is nothing that can push us up above 100%. Not getting tenure, not being, president of CORD, not being anything. There is nothing. And ironically, we expend so much energy trying to prove ourselves, trying to get above that line, trying to push our self-worth up when there's nothing we can do to push it either way. So focus on effort, learn to love the process, and then constantly and consciously decoupling our performance and our self-worth. Now, the other part of this that we also don't talk about is how managing our time requires us to manage our emotions. This is from that New York Times article. She writes that procrastination isn't some character flaw or curse on your ability to manage your time. It's a way of coping with challenging emotions and negative moods induced by a task, boredom, anxiety, insecurity, etc. And this certainly played out for me a few years ago. I had a paper that I had done all the research for, and it just needed to get written. And every time I would try to sit and write it, I would do something else. And I just kept saying, I don't have time. I've been so busy, crazy busy, super busy. And then a few years went by, and finally I realized, I've written several other papers. So what is it about this paper that I specifically am avoiding? And I realized it was because whenever I would sit down to try to write it, I would feel boredom, or I would feel anxiety that it won't get accepted, or insecurity that it would get accepted and no one would read it, or people would read it and they would hate it, or frustration because now it's been 3 years and I don't remember where all my data is, resentment, etc. So I think about this like an activation barrier. Once we get going with something, it is relatively easy, but it's that starting that is so difficult. It's this activation barrier to get things going. So I was curious about what is in that activation barrier. And some of it, I think, is that fear of failure. If we never start, then we can't fail. Some of it is self-worth preservation. If I don't really submit anything, then my paper can't get rejected. And then the third part of it is this avoidance of negative emotions. So how can we overcome the activation barrier of getting started? First, cultivate curiosity. I think about curiosity like a puppy. And those of you who are into the master adaptive learner model in medical education, curiosity is one of the batteries that powers that model. Curiosity, motivation, mindset, which we've talked about, and resilience. Those are the 4 batteries that power the master adaptive learner. So let your curiosity run around and look at, why are you avoiding this task? Get curious, not judgmental. Get curious about what emotions you're avoiding and what thoughts you're having that are creating those emotions. The next step is writing it down. This is one of the most powerful things you can do. In that moment where you're finding your mind is saying, oh, I don't want to do this. Let me just check email real quick. And then 3 hours later, all your day is gone. Identify the emotions that you are trying to avoid or that you are afraid of. Another way to overcome that activation barrier is to explore how the work aligns with your big values and mission. So remember, why are you even doing this in the first place? What was your motivation? I use this sometimes for doing my charts when I've come home from a day and then I have to go and finish my charts at home. And I think, well, how does this align with one of my big mission and values? Well, one of my values is to be a good physician. And to be a good physician, I need to turn my charts in. Another of my big goals is I am a sole financial provider for a family of 6. So I need to keep my job. And to do that, I have to do my charts. So this aligns with my big mission and values. Third, this is one of the second most powerful things you can do. Ask, what is the immediate next step? Now, you don't have to do this for every task. Some tasks that are easy, you can just do them. Tasks that are difficult, say, what is the immediate next step? So for writing that paper, and I use papers because that's something that many physicians tell me is one of the things they procrastinate on. The first step is I need to turn on my computer and pull up my file. I can do that. By breaking it down into a small step, I'm not giving my brain much room to object. Then I need to find where I'd written the method section, read it, and write one more paragraph. Or I need to find that figure and edit the content. So breaking it down into immediate next steps. Fourth, ask, can I do this for 20 minutes? This is called the Pomodoro method and has become very popular. The idea is that you set a timer for 20 minutes and say, let me just do this for 20 minutes. And then often you'll find after 20 minutes, you don't mind it so much. Now you're in a groove. Now you've gotten going, you're over that activation barrier, and you can keep going. Fifth, and this is kind of counterintuitive, plan to fail, or at least learn to be okay with it. Learn to be okay with small failures. I'm not talking about big, epic patient care failures or losing your job, but plan to be okay with small failures. Brene Brown says, if you have no tolerance for failure, you will not create anything new. Think about this. What if I told you every chess game I play, I win? Either that means I'm really, really good, or I'm only playing 2-year-olds because clearly I'm not playing enough opponents who are challenging me. If everything you do, you succeed in, then maybe you're not trying enough difficult things. So decide what you're going to do, plan it well, and then when you sit down to do it, this is where understanding your emotions will help you overcome the activation barriers. Finally, reflect. We don't learn from our experience, we learn from reflecting our experience. Reflection turns experience into insight. So look back at your days. How much deep work are you doing or have you done? How much shallow work are you doing? How does your day look? Is it scattered with lots of breaks, or is it clumped so that you're more efficient and effective? Then also reflect on your own motivation and the thought patterns that are driving your actions. So I told you, to get different results, you have to take different actions. To act differently, you have to think and feel differently. So let's return to our Stoics. Marcus Aurelius said, if you are pained by any external thing, it is not this thing that disturbs you, but your own judgment about it. And it is in your power to wipe out this judgment now. Now, this is a provocative statement, but let me show you how it can play out effectively for us. I want you to think, and I'm going to have you put some things in the chat, about all the things that you have to do, all the things that are going on, the stuff you have to write, the things you have to do at home, all of that. And then I want you to write in there, in the chat, how do you feel when you think about all of those things? How do you feel when you think about all of the things that you need to do? Worried, yes. Anxious, yes. Overwhelmed, yes, Nicholas. Overwhelmed is one of the most common. Overwhelmed, anxious, worried. Now, did anything in your life change from before I asked you that and after I asked you that? The only thing that changed in your life was your thoughts. You started thinking about all of those things that you have to do. So it is your thoughts that create your feelings. So next, then, the question becomes, how do we change our thoughts? How do we change our thoughts? And I want to give you just one quote from Viktor Frankl. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. So the idea is when we have these things in our life, often we just automatically respond. We're on autopilot. We are, oh my gosh, overwhelmed. But what if we created more space there and instead we chose our thoughts and we chose our responses? And there's a lot of ways to do that. Some simple ones come from cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's called a diffusion technique. So the idea is that we are often fused to our thoughts. We take that thought of this is horrible and I'm overwhelmed, and we unfuse from it. So for example, first writing the thoughts down. This is so important. And then replacing an either or thinking with ands. This is boring and frustrating, and I'm going to do it. Or replacing the thought itself with an observation. For example, I hate this work or this project will fail becomes I'm having the thought that I hate this work and the project will fail. These are some very simple ways to just move the needle some. Now, let's consider those same circumstances, all the things you have to do. Put in the chat now, how do you want to feel about those things? How do you want to feel about all the things that you have to do? Everything on your list, everything on your calendar. Content. Oh, I like that song. Good. Content. Somewhere between peaceful and excited. Yes, like at peace, but also excited to do the things. I want to feel confident. I want to feel interested. For goodness sake, this is my life. I want to feel excited. Yeah, Dan, motivated. So how do we create those feelings of motivation, excitement, competence, capability, interest, curiosity? We create those emotions by our thoughts. So for example, just noticing every time you start to spiral those thoughts of, oh my gosh, everything is crazy, I hate all this, creating new thoughts. I think about thoughts like a sweater, like I'll put one on, I don't like this one, I'll put on another one. I keep a list of time thoughts above my computer, things like, I can create the time for the things that are most important to me. Or how I spend my time is how I spend my life, and I'm going to choose that intentionally. Or time is on my side. Nothing happens to me. I create the things that are important for me. So these are some ways to just start to dial down that constant simmer of overwhelm. Now, warning, this is not a quick, easy one and done. And often changing our thoughts requires changing our identity narrative. I've worked with many people who say, oh, I'm just disorganized, or I work best in the last minute, or, for students, I'm just not a good test taker. I'm too overwhelmed to even start. And so we first have to undo that narrative and say, well, wait, let me be open to the idea that I can be an organized person. Let me be open to the idea that I can become a person who gets things done early. And then choosing the thoughts that allow us to feel motivated and capable and overcome those activation barriers. So I encourage you to begin to examine your thoughts, write them down, pick a thought that resonates most with you and see how is that making you feel, and identify and decide, is that the thought that you want to run with today, or is there a different one that would be more effective? Finally, the last framework that I'll give you, and I put this in the handout, this is called mental contrasting with implementation intentions. And we don't have time to fully unpack it, but I would encourage you to read this book or look at this book called Rethinking Positive Thinking. And it's a very evidence-based way to plan for something and plan for the inner obstacles. So let's say if your outcome that you want is, I want to finish this paper by X time, then you say, what are the inner obstacles to making that happen? Not COVID, not childcare, not funding, not external obstacles. What are the inner obstacles? And often that is things like, I won't prioritize it, or I don't like writing, and so I'm going to procrastinate on it. And then you create what's called an implementation intention, which is formed in this form of, when I encounter this obstacle, then I will do X. So when I feel like procrastinating, then I will do X. And you plan that ahead of time. So these are the 4 stages for intentionally managing your time: deciding, planning, doing, and then reflecting. And my final thing that I want to leave you here is a story about my turtle. When I was 13, my brother and I had little pet turtles, and we went away for a summer and gave them to a friend. And when we came back, the turtles had doubled in size. We were like, what happened? What did you do to our turtles? And it turned out that they had put them in a bigger box, and the turtles grow to fill the size of the box they're in. Now, that is the same with us. Many of you are probably familiar with the concept of the zone of proximal development, where there's some things that we're comfortable doing, some things that we're terrified of, and then in between that is the space where we can learn. We don't learn well when we're in our comfort zone. So we sometimes will avoid opportunities or avoid tasks. I've worked with many junior faculty who say, I just think I'm not good enough, I'm not as smart as everyone else, or I have this new responsibility, I don't feel like I'm good enough for it. That is the feeling of you being in a bigger box, and you will grow to fit that bigger box. And really, there's no other way to grow. You can't grow when you stay cooped in your comfort zone. You have to be out there, and you will feel like an imposter, but that's okay. I would worry more if I go through life only feeling comfortable, because then I'm never really expanding and growing. So to end, the only way to get more time in your day is to be strategic with what you do and efficient in how you do it. I encourage you to go home, reflect on these things, and think about what is really keeping you from creating the schedule that you want. Is it money? Is it a sense that you have to be constantly busy to relieve the crushing weight of expectation that society, your family, or your culture have put on you, or that you have put on yourself? What is really keeping you from it? And I would encourage you to think about what is one thing you want to do differently this week. I have given you a very fast-paced introduction to a lot of things. Pick one thing, pick one. It's been a pleasure talking with you. This is my website. You can reach me over email there or send me a message. This is my email and my website as well, and Twitter account. I would love to talk more with all of you.